Welcome to Midnight Grove, where stories linger like the fading colors of the evening sky. Tonight's tale, The Man Who Collected Sunsets, follows Claire, a journalist who notices an elderly man watching the sunset every night without fail. When she finally asks him why, she uncovers a love story written not in words, but in the quiet ritual of remembering. Some promises never fade, and some people never truly leave us. So settle in, breathe deep, and let this story carry you into a peaceful night. Chapter 1. The Bench by the Lake. Claire had never given much thought to sunsets. She supposed they were beautiful, an everyday kind of magic, painting the sky in colors that never repeated themselves exactly the same way. But life had a way of pulling her attention elsewhere. Deadlines, phone calls, the endless scroll of emails demanding answers. She had places to be. Sunsets were for people with time to spare, or apparently for people like Elliot Langley, a man who never missed a sunset. Claire had lived in the small lakeside town of Evermere for nearly a year now, and she had never once seen the old man miss an evening. Every night, just before the sky began to soften, Elliot would walk, slow, steady, unhurried, to the weathered wooden bench by the water's edge. He would sit, open his leather-bound sketchbook, and watch. His routine never changed. Even in the dead of winter, when the air turned sharp and the lake froze over, he would be there, wrapped in his old brown coat, breath curling in the cold. People noticed. They whispered theories. He used to be a painter, you know, never quite let it go. I heard he lost someone. Maybe he's waiting for her. Maybe it's just a habit. Some people don't like to let things go. Claire wasn't sure what to believe. But as a journalist, even one working at a town paper with more stories about lost pets than breaking news, she knew one thing. Every habit has a reason, and she was going to find out his. A quiet invitation. It was early autumn when she finally decided to approach him. Elliot didn't look up, but after a pause he gestured to the open space beside him. She sat. For a long while neither of them spoke. Claire had expected the silence to feel awkward, but instead it felt uncomplicated, like the space had always been meant for two. Finally, Elliot broke the quiet. "You're the reporter." Claire blinked. "You know who I am?" Elliot's lips curled into a small smile. "It's a small town." Claire nodded. "Fair enough." A few more minutes passed, filled only with the soft scratching of pencil against paper. Then, unable to hold back her curiosity, she asked. The evening air was crisp, the scent of fallen leaves mingling with the cool breeze rolling off the water. Elliot sat where he always did, his sketchbook open on his lap, pencil moving in slow, deliberate strokes. Claire hesitated. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she walked over. "Mind if I sit? What do you see when you look at the sunset?" Elliot didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a slow breath, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Something worth remembering." Claire frowned slightly. "Do you mean the colors?" Elliot finally turned to look at her. His eyes were sharp, a blue that had seen decades, yet somehow still held the quiet curiosity of someone who had never stopped looking. I mean, he said softly, everything. The first page of a story. Claire glanced down at his sketchbook. Most people in town assumed Elliot was an artist, but now that she was sitting beside him, she saw the truth. They weren't paintings. They weren't even detailed drawings. They were memories. Tiny sketches of people, places, fragments of time, all dated in careful handwriting. On tonight's page, she saw the rough outline of a woman standing by the water, looking at the sunset. Claire's breath caught. Who is she? Elliot didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed the sketchbook, resting his hands on the worn leather cover. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Someone I once knew." And just like that, Claire realized that this wasn't just a story about sunsets. It was a story about someone he had lost, a promise left unfinished. The sky darkened, the last streaks of amber fading into deep twilight. Elliot stood, slipping the sketchbook into his coat pocket. "I should be going," he said simply. Claire hesitated. "Will you be here tomorrow?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I'm always here." Then, with the slow, steady steps of someone who knew exactly where he was going, he walked away. Claire remained on the bench a while longer, staring at the lake, trying to imagine what kind of promise could keep a man coming back to the same spot for years. She didn't have the answer. But for the first time in a long time, she wanted to know. And she had a feeling tomorrow's sunset would bring her a little closer. Chapter 2. The Story in the Sky. The next evening, Claire returned to the bench by the lake. She wasn't sure if Elliot would be there. Even though he had said, "I'm always here," there was something about the way he had spoken, like a man whose presence depended on more than just routine. But as the sun dipped lower, there he was, sitting in the same spot, sketchbook open, waiting. Claire exhaled, feeling something unspoken settle between them. Then, without asking, she sat beside him. And this time Elliot spoke first. "You came back." Claire smiled. "I wanted to see another sunset." Elliot nodded slowly, gaze never leaving the horizon. "Then watch closely," he murmured, "because they never happen the same way twice." The Book of Memories. For a while they simply watched. The sky shifted from soft blue to warm gold, the water reflecting streaks of orange that shimmered with each ripple. Claire let herself take it in, really take it in, the way Elliot seemed to do so effortlessly. And then, after what felt like a long and careful silence, she asked, "The woman you sketched yesterday, and who was she?" Elliot didn't react at first, but after a moment, he reached into his coat and pulled out his sketchbook. He ran his hand over the worn leather cover, then, without looking at Claire, he carefully placed it in her lap. Claire hesitated. Then, with gentle hands, she opened it, and what she saw inside took her breath away. A lifetime in sketches. Page after page, sunsets filled the book. Dozens, hundreds, each one dated, each one capturing the way the sky had shifted on that particular evening. Some pages had quick, simple lines, a fleeting moment captured in a few strokes. Others were more detailed, drawn with careful attention, as if Elliot had wanted to remember everything. But what struck Claire the most were the sketches of her, the woman, the same woman appearing over and over again. Sometimes she was alone standing by the lake. Other times she was sitting beside Elliot watching the colors change. Her hair was drawn with soft flowing lines, her posture always relaxed, like someone who had spent years watching the world turn golden without ever needing to rush. Beneath one of the sketches, Elliot had written a single sentence in small, neat handwriting. She loved the sky. Claire ran her fingertips over the words, her throat tightening. She was your wife, she whispered. Elliot nodded, and then finally he told her the story. Her love remembered. Her name was Margaret, Elliot said softly. We met when we were 19. I was studying architecture. She was an artist, the kind of person who saw beauty in things most people never noticed. The way light reflects off a window, the pattern of ripples in the water, the curve of tree branches in the wind. But her favorite thing, the thing she loved most, was the sky. Claire listened, barely breathing. Elliot's voice was steady, but his hands, the same hands that had sketched so many sunsets, trembled slightly as he turned another page. She used to say that sunsets were like stories, that no two were ever the same, and if you paid attention, you could see something new in each one. She made me watch them with her, every evening, no matter where we were. Even if we were in the middle of an argument, she would grab my hand and say, "Look, just look for a moment." A small bittersweet smile tugged at the corner of his lips, and I always did. Claire swallowed, feeling the quiet weight of his words. "What happened to her?" she asked gently. Elliot turned to the final page in the sketchbook, and there, in careful, deliberate strokes, was a sunset. But this one was different. It was softer, unfinished, the colors fading at the edges, and below it, the date was written 10 years ago. Elliot took a deep breath. "She passed away," he said simply. His voice didn't break. But there was something about the way he held himself, steady, composed, but deeply, deeply quiet, that told Claire everything. This was a man who had carried his grief for a long time, and he had chosen to carry it this way, in the form of sunsets, in the form of remembering, a promise that never faded. Claire looked back at the sketchbook. At the dates, at the sheer number of them. "You never stopped watching them," she murmured. Elliot shook his head. "No." "Why?" Elliot let out a slow breath, his gaze softening as he looked toward the lake. "Because I promised her I wouldn't." Claire blinked. "You promised to keep watching sunsets?" Elliot nodded. "She asked me near the end. She knew I would struggle without her. She knew the days would get quieter and the house would feel too big and the mornings wouldn't feel like mornings anymore. So she told me, if you ever feel lost, just watch the sunset and remember I'm watching it too." He turned to Claire, his blue eyes reflecting the golden sky. "I kept my promise. Some promises don't fade." The sun dipped lower, casting the water in shades of copper and pink. Claire didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything. She just sat there watching as the sky changed, slowly, beautifully, endlessly. After a while, Elliot spoke again. "You asked me what I see when I look at the sunset." Claire nodded. Elliot closed his sketchbook. I see her. And somehow Claire understood. The last page. As the last light faded, Elliot stood. Claire stood with him. But this time, before he could walk away, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. Then, flipping to a blank page, she started to write. Elliot raised an eyebrow. What are you doing? Claire smiled softly. I think some stories deserve to be remembered. Elliot was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time since she had met him, he looked at her with something like gratitude. Then make sure you get it right, he said. And with that he walked away, leaving Claire watching the sky, watching the story in the sunset. And this time, she would remember. Thank you for joining us at Midnight Grove for The Man Who Collected Sunsets. Elliot's story reminds us that love is not only found in the past, but in the ways we choose to keep it alive. As you drift into sleep, may you think of the quiet beauty of the sky, the warmth of a fading sunset, and the stories we carry in our hearts. Sleep well, and we'll see you next time for another gentle bedtime story.